Most Texas towns have changed quite dramatically over the past 60 years, with new highways, new subdivisions, and new shopping centers replacing whatever used to be there. But scattered across this entire state are a handful of towns where time genuinely seems to have stopped somewhere around the 1960s, and in some cases even earlier, and simply never started moving again. These are not staged tourist attractions built to look old. These are real towns where the population stopped growing, the downtown stopped changing, and daily life still looks remarkably close to how it looked 2 generations ago. Number 1 on this list inspired one of the most famous films ever made about small-town Texas decline, and the resemblance between the movie and the real town today is honestly hard to believe. If towns frozen in time like this fascinate you, go ahead and hit like on this video and subscribe, since we cover forgotten places like these every week. Let's start counting down at number 10. Number 10. Electra. Number 10 is Electra, a North Texas town that once called itself the pump jack capital of Texas, after a major oil discovery in the early 20th century, turned it into a genuine boomtown almost overnight. Electra's population grew rapidly during that early boom period, and the town built out a downtown and residential district to match its sudden prosperity. When the oil boom slowed decades later, growth in Electra essentially stopped, and much of the town's downtown architecture has remained unchanged since that earlier boom period, including a number of storefronts that have sat vacant or lightly used for decades. Working pump jacks still dot the landscape around town, a visible reminder of the industry that built Electra in the first place, even though the boom-era prosperity itself never returned. The town's population has stayed relatively flat for generations, and daily life here moves at a pace that feels noticeably slower than in nearby Wichita Falls. Electra's downtown murals and preserved storefronts have become a modest point of local pride, giving visitors a genuine look at what a small Texas oil town looked like during its original boom, largely untouched by the decades of redevelopment seen elsewhere in the region. If towns like this are exactly the kind of forgotten history you enjoy, subscribe now, because this list only gets more interesting from here. Number 9. Ranger. Number 9 is Ranger, a central West Texas town that experienced one of the most dramatic oil booms in state history after a major discovery in 1917 briefly turned it into one of the fastest-growing towns in the country. Thousands of workers poured into Ranger within a matter of months, and the town's population and infrastructure expanded at a pace that could not be sustained once the boom inevitably slowed. When production declined in the years that followed, much of that rapid growth reversed just as quickly as it had arrived, leaving Ranger with a downtown built for a much larger population than it has held for most of the decades since. Many of the commercial buildings constructed during the height of the boom still stand today, largely unchanged, since the population never grew enough afterward to justify replacing them with anything newer. Ranger's economy today leans on a mix of small-scale oil and gas activity, agriculture, and its location along Interstate 20, though none of these have brought back the rapid growth the town saw during its original boom. The contrast between Ranger's oversized early 20th century downtown and its much smaller modern population gives the town a distinctly frozen-in-time feeling that is hard to find anywhere else in the state. Number 8. Thurber. Number 8 is Thurber, a former company coal mining town in Erath County that was once one of the largest towns in Texas, with a population that reportedly topped 10,000 residents during its early 20th century peak. Thurber was built and entirely owned by a single mining company, which controlled the housing, the stores, and even the local currency used by workers, an unusual arrangement even by the standards of company towns at the time. When the coal industry declined and the company shifted its focus toward oil interests in the 1930s, Thurber was largely dismantled, with many buildings sold off or demolished entirely within a short period of time. Today, only a handful of structures remain standing, including the old smokestack, a historic water tower, and the New York Hill Cemetery, where many of the town's original residents are buried. What was once one of the largest towns in the state is now essentially a rest stop along Interstate 20, with a small museum preserving what little remains of Thurber's history. Few places in Texas illustrate a town frozen in decline quite as dramatically as Thurber, a community that essentially stopped existing generations ago and never came back, leaving behind only scattered brick foundations where entire neighborhood blocks used to stand. Number 7. Van Horn. Number 7 is Van Horn, a small West Texas town along the historic Highway 90 corridor that grew up specifically to serve travelers passing through on their way between El Paso and the rest of the state. During the mid-20th century highway travel boom, Van Horn built out a strip of motor courts and motels designed in the retro style popular at the time, many of which are still standing today, largely unchanged from their original construction. When Interstate 10 was completed and routed travelers slightly differently, some of the through traffic that once supported Van Horn's motel strip declined, and the town's growth slowed considerably in the decades that followed. Several of the original mid-century motel signs and buildings remain in place today, giving Van Horn's main strip a genuinely preserved retro highway feel that has become a point of interest for travelers exploring West Texas. The town's population has remained small and relatively stable for decades, and much of the local economy still centers on serving highway travelers, ranching, and a modest amount of nearby oil field activity. For anyone driving the long stretch of highway between El Paso and the Hill Country, Van Horn offers a genuine look at what mid-century Texas highway travel actually looked like. Number 6. Sanderson. Number 6 is Sanderson, a remote West Texas town whose modern history was shaped almost entirely by a single catastrophic event on June 11, 1965, when a flash flood tore through the town after a massive rainstorm overwhelmed the normally dry creek beds running through the community. The flood destroyed a significant portion of downtown Sanderson and killed more than 24 residents, remaining one of the deadliest flash floods in Texas history. Rebuilding after the disaster was limited, and the town's population and overall development have remained essentially flat in the decades since, giving Sanderson a genuinely frozen quality that traces directly back to that single night. Sanderson's economy today leans on ranching and its position along a major rail line, though neither has brought significant growth back to the town since the flood. Several buildings damaged during the 1965 flood were never fully rebuilt, and the surrounding desert terrain has changed little in the decades since. For a town whose entire modern trajectory was shaped by one devastating night in the 1960s, Sanderson remains one of the clearest examples in the entire state of a community that simply never returned to the growth path it was on before disaster struck. Number 5. Quanah. Number 5 is Quanah, a North Texas railroad town named after Comanche chief Quanah Parker that reached its peak population and prosperity during the early to mid-20th century, when the railroad and surrounding agriculture supported a thriving downtown. As rail traffic declined in the decades that followed and agricultural jobs became increasingly mechanized, Quanah's population began a slow decline that has continued for generations, leaving the town with a downtown built for a much larger community than currently lives there. Several of Quanah's historic buildings, including its courthouse and a number of early 20th century commercial structures, remain standing largely unchanged, giving the town's core a preserved, mid-century feel. Local murals throughout downtown Quanah depict scenes from the town's railroad and Comanche history, a modest effort by residents to keep that history visible even as the population has continued to shrink. The town's economy today relies on a mix of agriculture, a small amount of gypsum mining nearby, and limited local retail, none of which have reversed the decades-long population trend. Quanah stands today largely as it did generations ago, a railroad town whose growth stopped once the industries that built it stopped growing themselves. Number 4. Marathon. Number 4 is Marathon, a tiny high-desert town in far west Texas, built around a rail stop that once served as a shipping point for cattle and ranching operations across the surrounding Big Bend region. The town's population has remained remarkably small for generations, and much of its historic character centers on the Gage Hotel, a ranch-style hotel built in 1927 that has been preserved rather than replaced over the decades since. Marathon's downtown remains compact, with a handful of businesses that have operated for generations, largely unaffected by the kind of rapid development seen in other parts of the state. The surrounding high desert landscape has changed very little, and the town's isolation, sitting roughly 30 miles from the entrance to Big Bend National Park, has helped keep both development and population growth to a minimum. Ranching remains central to the local economy, alongside a modest but steady stream of visitors passing through on their way into the national park. Marathon's slow, unhurried pace and largely unchanged downtown give it a genuinely frozen-in-time quality that has made it a quiet favorite among travelers looking for an authentic, unpolished stop in far west Texas, one that has never bothered chasing the crowds bigger nearby attractions eventually pull in. Number 3. Balmorhea. Number 3 is Balmorhea, a small West Texas town best known for San Solomon Springs, a natural spring-fed pool built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s that remains one of the largest spring-fed swimming pools in the entire world. The pool itself has changed remarkably little since its original construction, still filled by the same natural springs, and still surrounded by much of its original stonework and structures. The town surrounding the pool has grown very little over the decades, with a population that has remained small and a downtown that has stayed modest in size and scope. Agriculture, particularly cotton and alfalfa farming, supported by the region's natural springs, remains central to the local economy, alongside a small tourism trade tied almost entirely to the pool itself. Balmorhea's isolation in far west Texas has helped keep both development and population growth minimal for generations, leaving the town looking remarkably similar to how it appeared decades ago. For visitors seeking out a genuinely unchanged piece of mid-20th century public works history, Balmorhea offers one of the most well-preserved examples left anywhere in the state. Before we get to number 1, if towns like these genuinely surprise you, go ahead and drop a like on this video. Number 2. Luckenbach. Number 2 is Luckenbach, an unincorporated hill country hamlet so small that its population has been jokingly listed as a handful of residents for decades. Built around a general store and dance hall that date back to the mid-19th century. Luckenbach became nationally famous after the 1977 Waylon Jennings song of the same name turned the tiny community into a symbol of simple, small-town Texas living, even though the town itself never grew to match that fame. The general store and dance hall at the center of Luckenbach remain essentially unchanged from decades past, still hosting live music, domino games, and casual gatherings the same way they have for generations. Despite its national name recognition, Luckenbach has deliberately avoided commercial development, with no gas stations, chain businesses, or modern additions altering its original mid-century character. The surrounding hill country landscape has changed relatively little as well, keeping the drive into Luckenbach feeling much the same as it did when the famous song was first recorded. Visitors continue to make the trip specifically because Luckenbach has stayed exactly what it always was, a tiny gathering spot rather than a polished tourist attraction. Few places in Texas demonstrate how a town can become nationally famous while still remaining almost entirely frozen in time, population and all. Number 1. Archer City. Number 1 is Archer City, a small North Texas town that became permanently linked to small-town decline after author Larry McMurtry, who grew up there, set his 1966 novel The Last Picture Show in a thinly disguised version of the town, later adapted into the acclaimed 1971 film, shot largely on location in Archer City itself. The movie captured a fading, mid-century small-town atmosphere, and remarkably, much of Archer City's downtown today still resembles what audiences saw on screen more than 50 years ago. The Royal Theater, the movie house that inspired the film's central setting, still stands in downtown Archer City, preserved as a local landmark, even though it stopped regularly showing films decades ago. McMurtry later opened Booked Up, a massive used bookstore that once occupied several buildings across the small downtown, drawing book collectors from around the country to a town that otherwise sees very little outside traffic. Archer City's population has remained small for generations, and much of its historic downtown architecture has never been significantly altered, giving visitors today an experience remarkably close to what the film depicted. Ranching remains central to the surrounding county's economy, much as it was when McMurtry was growing up there, with little large-scale development to disrupt that continuity. For a town whose defining cultural legacy is literally about a small town fading into the past, Archer City today still looks almost exactly the way that story described it. That covers all 10 of these small towns still frozen somewhere in Texas's past, places where population growth stopped decades ago and the downtown simply never caught up to the rest of the state. Some of these towns were shaped by booms that ended too quickly, others by disasters that never fully allowed a comeback, but all of them offer a genuine, honest look at what small-town Texas used to look like almost everywhere, decades before interstates and suburbs reshaped the rest of the state. If you want more videos covering the forgotten and genuinely frozen-in-time corners of this entire country, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who truly loves real Texas history. We will genuinely see you again in the next one.